Hello မင်္ဂလာပါစေ။ကဲဘုရားက UN မှာလုပ်တဲ့အစည်းအဝေးကြောင့်ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့ပေါ့နော်တင်ပေးလို့ပါစေ။နောက်ကြတဲ့အတွက် sorry ပါလို့နော်အချိန်တွေကလည်းမတူဆိုတော့လေနော်ပြီးတော့translate လုပ်တော့ file ကအရင်ကြီးတော့လေ share နေတာအဲ့ဒါကြောင့်ပေါ့နော်အဲ့တော့မကြည့်ရတိတ်ချအကုန်လုံးမကြည့်ရသေးတဲ့နောက်ထောင်ရသေးတဲ့သူတွေတော့ပေါ့နော်အပြည့်စုံတော်လန်ပြီးသူတွေတက်တကယ်ကိုခွန်အားရစရာတွေကြီးပဲမို့လို့အားလုံးကိုတိတ်ချလေးအဆုံးထိနားထောင်စေချင်ပါတယ်အဆုံးထိကြည့်စေချင်ပါတယ်လို့နော်ပြီးတော့ video file က1 hour ထိပဲတင်လို့ရတာဖြစ်တဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်မို့အဲ့ကျ part 1 part 2အဲ့လိုခွဲပြီးတော့တင်ပေးမယ်နော်နှစ်ပိုင်းခွဲပြီးတင်ပေးပါမယ်ဒါပေမဲ့အဆုံးထိတော့နားထောင်စီချင်တယ်ပေါ့နော်အားလုံးကိုကြည့်စီချင်တယ်ပေါ့နော်စာတန်းထိုးလိုက်ပါနော်ကျေးဇူးပါမကြည့်ရသေးတဲ့လူတွေအတွက်ပါအားလုံးအပြည့်စုံကြည့်ရသေးတဲ့လူတွေအတွက်ပါတော်တော်လေးကိုစကလုံးတွေအရန်ကိုမိုက်ပါတယ်နော်နောက်မှဆက်ပြီးတော့ reaction ထပ်လုပ်မယ်ပေါ့နော်ပြီးတော့အဲ့ထဲမှာတော့အဆိုးဆုံးကတော့ Russian မှတက်တော့နော်အဲ့ကမှကို reaction နောက်မှလုပ်မယ်နော်ဆက်ပြီးတော့ okay အဲ့တော့အားလုံးပဲကြည့်ရှုကြနော်အဆုံးထိ
Good afternoon. I call to order the informal meeting of the plenary to hear a briefing by the Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Myanmar. As announced in my letter on May 19th, 2026, this briefing is convened pursuant to Resolution 80/221 entitled Situation of Human Rights of Rohingya Muslims and Other Minorities in Myanmar of December 18th, 2025. I would like to welcome Ms. Julie Bishop, Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Myanmar. Thank you so much for joining and having this briefing today. I kindly remind delegation that there will be an opportunity for interventions after the briefing. I will now make a statement as the President of the General Assembly. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I welcome the timely briefing from the Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Myanmar, Ms. Julie Bishop, and commend her ongoing efforts to help find a peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable path forward for the people of Myanmar. Many of you were present last September at the high-level conference on the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar, where member states and civil society participants spoke clearly about the priorities ahead. 3 stood out. First, advancing a lasting resolution on this crisis, one centered on building trust among all communities and giving them a shared stake in Myanmar's future as part of an inclusive peace process. Second, establishing the conditions for refugees to return home voluntarily, safely, and with dignity. Third, ensuring adequate and sustained financial support to meet the basic needs of refugees and internally displaced persons, including food, healthcare, and education. Today's briefing gives us an opportunity to hear directly from the Special Envoy, take stock of the situation in Myanmar, and consider how we can respond with greater urgency and unity. Since we met in September, the situation in Myanmar, and especially for the Rohingya people, has remained alarming. As of May, the humanitarian needs and response plan for Myanmar in 2026 is only 38% funded, with $340 million received against the $890 million required. That gap is measured in meals not served and treatment not provided. Since the end of February, a sharp rise in food and fuel prices, driven in part by the crisis in the Middle East, has placed further pressure on families across the country. Staple food prices have risen by 18% nationwide on average, resulting in acute food insecurity for approximately 12.4 million people, a quarter of Myanmar's population. Meanwhile, violence against civilians has intensified, with 1,140 airstrikes on civilian targets in 2025 alone, killing people indiscriminately, including children. These attacks have continued this year. This violence is compounded by continued repression. The conditions for peace require the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners and others arbitrarily detained. Peace also requires inclusion, accountability, and protection for all communities. Myanmar's future cannot be built with Rohingya and other minorities continue to face discrimination, exclusion, displacement, and insecurity. Their rights, dignity, and place in Myanmar's future must be recognized as part of any sustainable solution. We cannot allow a 9th year of Rohingya crisis to pass without change. Many children know nothing than displacement. Therefore, renewing our commitment in keeping with Resolution 80/221 to support humanitarian efforts that meet the needs of all those affected and to advance a sustainable solution to the situation in Myanmar, including the challenges faced by the Rohingya and other minorities, is crucial. But it means little without delivery and implementation on the ground. Therefore, it is so important to underline our strong commitment as a General Assembly, and it's my honor to give the floor to the Special Envoy, Ms. Bishop. We look forward to your briefing. Please.
Madam President, distinguished delegates, today I will report on the highly polarised and increasingly bleak situation in Myanmar. But first, allow me to remind Member States of the origin of my role in tackling the crisis in Myanmar. While the country has suffered decades of conflict and turmoil, the mandate of the Special Envoy was established by a 2017 General Assembly resolution adopted in the aftermath of the forced mass displacement of the Rohingya from Myanmar. The plight of the Rohingya remains dire. The mandate has been renewed annually and expanded in scope, particularly following the military takeover in 2021 and the ensuing violence and suffering. In 2022, the Security Council adopted its landmark resolution 2669. The General Assembly and the Security Council have consistently called for a cessation of hostilities, inclusive dialogue, unfettered humanitarian access, and the release of political prisoners. Both have called for cooperation between the United Nations and ASEAN, emphasising the role of the respective special envoys. I have now collaborated with 3 ASEAN special envoys, currently with Secretary of Foreign Affairs Lazaro of the Philippines, and look forward to continuing the collaboration with the 2027 Chair, Singapore, in support of ASEAN centrality. As Myanmar's multi-layered crisis within the country continues unabated, the consequences are increasingly felt far beyond its borders, with growing regional and global implications. 2 years into this role, I have briefed the General Assembly and the Security Council 5 times each, including the high-level conference on the Rohingya and other minorities in 2025. In my 10 formal presentations to Member States, I have reported on a deepening crisis, erosion of the rule of law, consistent failure to protect civilians, and a widening governance vacuum exploited by criminal syndicates. Within the limited resources available to my office, I have continued direct contact with a significant range of stakeholders from all sides of this crisis, maintaining dialogue with all interested member states and parties. I have undertaken 4 visits to Myanmar and have met with Min Online on 3 occasions, most recently on the 21st of May. I have held meetings in Yangon and Naypyidaw, as well as in Mandalay, where I met families who have lost everything in the 2025 earthquake, compounding the suffering from the conflict. I have continued meeting with the National League for Democracy, the National Unity Government, ethnic groups, civil society organisations and more. Recently, I have consulted with the Steering Council for the Emergence of a Federal Democratic Union, the SCEF Alliance, which aims to strengthen greater cooperation among resistance groups. I have travelled to many capitals to meet with leaders of influence, giving priority in my efforts to influencing the most influential actors, particularly Myanmar's neighbours, and strengthening cooperation with regional organisations, especially ASEAN, in line with the UN Charter and the special envoys of its rotating chair, as well as other special envoys. In this respect, I also acknowledge the European Union and the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, the co-sponsors of the General Assembly resolution mandating my role, for their continued cooperation. As I continue to hold frank and hard-hitting discussions with all parties, it remains the case that there are competing and conflicting narratives on virtually every aspect of the crisis. For example, the narrative from the authorities in Naypyidaw after the military-administered election contrasts starkly with the accounts of communities who claim indiscriminate aerial bombing and a denial of essential services continued throughout the process. Tragically, the ground realities show that conditions in Myanmar continue to deteriorate. Records are being set for all the wrong reasons. Myanmar is a global epicentre for cybercrime. Transnational criminal syndicates operating industrial-scale scam compounds have expanded their human trafficking networks as far as Africa and targeted victims across the United States, Asia and beyond. The country is now a global supplier of methamphetamine and opium. Myanmar has become the world's leading source of landmine casualties, 2025 being the deadliest year for children in Myanmar since the military takeover, with airstrikes the leading cause of civilian casualties. The collapse of the health systems risks triggering regional disease outbreaks. Myanmar is now among the world's 6th most severe hunger spots. It is experiencing high levels of displacement, with more than 3.7 million people internally displaced and a further 1.6 million across the region. Bangladesh alone hosts some 1.2 million Rohingya refugees, with Cox's Bazar now the world's largest refugee camp. These measures of human suffering alone should compel us to take action to prevent further deterioration. Some have claimed that the holding of an election would represent a new chapter. It would turn the page on the events triggered by the 2021 takeover. Last October, I referred member states to the military's plans to hold general elections in 3 phases. Polling concluded in January 2026, with the Union's Solidarity Development Party, the USDP, the political wing of the military, securing a predictable landslide victory. Combined with the 25% of seats reserved for military appointees under the 2008 Constitution, the military's role in the life of the people of Myanmar has been further entrenched. Any opposition participation was severely restricted. In March, the military legislature elected Min Aung Hlaing as its political leader, foregoing his role as Commander-in-Chief. Military officers continued to occupy key positions. The overall outcome is viewed by a number of Myanmar stakeholders as a consolidation of power for the military. It is not seen as a transition to a civilian government. The military claimed free and fair polls and a legitimate process. Many on the ground described tight security, a reduced electorate, the exclusion of major political parties, low turnout and polls conducted in the midst of an ongoing armed conflict. The United Nations neither supported nor observed this process. A number of nations have taken the outcome of the polls to be an opportunity to normalise relations with Naypyidaw. Others have not. Those who participated in and supported the election of a civilian government in 2020 are more determined than ever to seek accountability. On issues of recognition, I remain guided by the Security Council and General Assembly, for only member states can make that call. I have been urged to be clear-eyed about the realities in Myanmar. I'm continuously called upon to speak truth to the military leaders and supporters in accordance with the values and principles of the United Nations. Many claim that the overthrow of an elected government, the detention of its leaders and continued attacks on civilians cannot justify a return to normalcy. Engagement based on self-interest without reference to these realities is a lost opportunity. Consistent with ASEAN's position, I have echoed the Secretary-General's caution that an electoral process without a cessation of hostilities and commitment to inclusive dialogue risks fueling further violence. Throughout the polls, military operations and aerial attacks continued, including strikes on civilian areas, with children among the victims. Villages are facing pressure from different armed actors, including forced labour and recruitment, extortion at checkpoints, and restrictions on movement and on the delivery of essential humanitarian support. The Secretary-General has condemned all forms of violence and has called on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and uphold their obligations under international human rights law and humanitarian law. I must report that neither these calls nor those of the General Assembly and Security Council have been heeded, in fact, have been ignored. Of growing concern is the situation facing young people. In our discussions, I am told that conscription by both the Myanmar military and resistance forces is increasing. Young people are fleeing, attempting perilous journeys, including by sea, becoming vulnerable to trafficking, exploitation, and the illicit economies driven by the drug trade and scam operations. Education opportunities are limited. Women's groups also report deepening risks, including conflict-related sexual violence. Against this background, I continue to encourage a range of actors to explore dialogue, and I continue my appeals for conditions to be established that are conducive to a cessation of violence wherever common ground can be found. I remain committed to helping bridge the divide in support of a Myanmar-led and Myanmar-owned peace process. Some leaders have appealed for stakeholders to engage adversaries as future partners, not as permanent enemies. This requires an end to the fighting on all sides. Around a third of the population live in poverty, and the economy remains stagnant. For diversified investment and assistance to return, there must be tangible progress. During my fourth visit to Myanmar last month, I emphasised in all my meetings civilian protection, humanitarian acts, including a 100-day program on economic recovery and national reconciliation. He referred to his renewed invitations to armed resistance groups and ethnic armed organisations to join peace negotiations. I conveyed stakeholders' lack of confidence in calls for dialogue while military operations escalate. Others have questioned how Naypyidaw can gain legitimacy through diplomatic engagement while maintaining a regime marked by restrictions on fundamental freedoms and human rights violations. The announcement of the release from detention of President Win Myint gave initial hope for steps toward reconciliation, but the conditionality of his release has tempered international goodwill. I have repeatedly raised with Naypyidaw the predicament of State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, who was re-elected in November 2020, but condemned to a harsh and punitive detention after the military takeover. There have been no independent, verifiable reports of her circumstances for years. Today, on her 81st birthday, I urge others to join with me in calling for her release. In the eyes of many, there can be no progress to peace while ever State Councillor Daw Suu is held prisoner. I reiterate the calls of this body for the immediate and unconditional release of all those arbitrarily detained, also reflected in the Security Council Resolution 2669. Without an inclusive peace process and negotiated political solution, Myanmar's socio-economic conditions will continue to deteriorate. Almost 10 years after their forced displacement, the Rohingya, most of whom are stateless, still face immense obstacles to a safe, voluntary, dignified and sustainable return to Myanmar. As we observe World Refugee Day tomorrow, I sound the alarm on behalf of those who have been forced to flee war, violence and persecution. The escalating hate speech and online abuse in the region, especially towards Rohingya refugees, is also alarming. In my recent meetings with Rohingya representatives, they appealed for an end to violence and for a pathway toward peace, self-reliance, citizenship and enjoyment of their basic rights, stressing that accountability for all perpetrators remains essential to reconciliation. An inclusive Myanmar cannot be achieved without safety, justice and opportunity for all communities, including the Rohingya, and without addressing the root causes of conflict, discrimination and exclusion. The United Nations must stand firmly for peaceful, lawful and inclusive processes. The United Nations, through its agencies, funds and programs, will stay and deliver in Myanmar despite immense challenges. As Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator ad interim, Gwyn Lewis, has emphasised, emergency assistance must be complemented by investment in livelihoods, in education, health and recovery if people are to rebuild their lives with dignity. This requires sustained and predictable funding. Myanmar has long presented a critical opportunity for the United Nations, working with ASEAN and other partners, to demonstrate its relevance in a world beset by conflict. The international community must remain steadfast in solidarity with the people of Myanmar and be guided by their appeals for help. I thank delegates for their support.
I thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Myanmar for her report. This meeting will not have a pre-established list of speakers. Delegations wishing to take the floor are invited to press the microphone button now. Members are requested to limit their intervention to 5 minutes when speaking on behalf of a group and 3 minutes when speaking in a national capacity. Time limit will be strictly enforced through an automatic microphone cutoff. A timer will be projected on screen. Those speaking on behalf of a group should approach the Secretariat to be given priority in the speaking order. As a first speaker, I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union, followed by Myanmar and Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam Special Envoy. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia, as well as San Marino, align themselves with this statement. We welcome this briefing, as mandated by General Assembly Resolution 221 adopted by consensus last December. And the EU is pleased to have collaborated closely with the OIC on this important resolution, which we first introduced in 2018 in response to the atrocities against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar that forced over 1 million people to flee the country. Since the military coup in February 2021, the situation has deteriorated dramatically. The Myanmar military continues to inflict unimaginable suffering that has even increased since we met here a year ago. Horrific and systematic violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law persist, with recent reports indicating that bombardments have deliberately targeted schools and hospitals. Children were killed or injured in at least 640 airstrikes since the coup, and persons in vulnerable situations continue to suffer disproportionately. Non-state armed groups are also documented as committing human rights abuses. The military staged elections that were neither free nor fair and conducted in a climate of violence, repression and exclusion, followed by the rebranding of military rule under a nominally civilian administration, do not confer legitimacy. The conditions for the voluntary, safe, dignified and sustainable return of all refugees and displaced persons remain non-existent. Madam Special Envoy, the EU and its member states fully support your vital work and efforts in pursuing a better future for the people of Myanmar. And let me take this opportunity to reiterate our key concerns and calls for action. The regime must immediately cease all violence and commit to a genuine and lasting cessation of hostilities. Security Council Resolution 2669, as well as provisional measures ordered by the ICJ, must be respected and implemented. States must prevent these atrocities by ending the military's access to arms and military equipment, including cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines. We recall the provisions in the Arms Trade Treaty and reiterate our call for a global arms embargo on Myanmar. The humanitarian emergency remains catastrophic. More than 60 million people require life-saving assistance and protection, while internal displacement has reached record levels. International humanitarian law and humanitarian principles must be respected. All parties must allow immediate, full, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access throughout the country. And we also call on all parties to ensure protection of all minorities in Myanmar and in host countries. Bangladesh's generosity in providing shelter and safety to over 1.1 million Rohingya refugees is commendable and saves lives. Any durable solution must address the root causes of the Rohingya crisis. Meaningful participation of all stakeholders must be ensured before any elections can be considered credible. The EU calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all those arbitrarily detained, including political prisoners, among which Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, who indeed today is turning 81 and is imprisoned as we speak. Justice and accountability are essential for lasting peace and reconciliation. We strongly support the work of the IIMM, the ICC and the ICJ in investigating and pursuing accountability efforts for war crimes, crimes against humanity and possible genocide. We are deeply concerned by the regime's enforcement of mandatory conscription laws, which systematically weaponize vulnerable youth and minority populations, as well as the expansion of transnational cybercrime and scam syndicates. We reaffirm our full support for the central role of ASEAN. The 5-point consensus sets out key criteria for putting Myanmar back on the path towards stability. And to this end, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights has recently conducted a high-level engagement with ASEAN and its member states.
Representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states and other member states. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar, followed by Bangladesh and Singapore.
Madam President, all protocol observed. Madam Special Envoy, I thank you for your unwavering commitment in discharging your mandate and your dedicated engagement with the crisis in Myanmar, as well as your comprehensive statement. The junta has escalated its area terror campaign against civilians to horrifying news extremes in 2026. On one aspect, the safe, voluntary and dignified return of Rohingya refugees remain unattainable under the military junta. The awaited decisions of the ICJ on the case between the Gambia and Myanmar will help find ways for a sustainable solution. On another aspect, more than 31,000 people, including political leaders, artists, and activists, had been arbitrarily detained. Today, State Councillor Daw Aung San Suu Kyi turns 81 years old, marking yet another birthday in absolute isolation. She remains a stark symbol of the junta's war on our fundamental human rights and its cruelty. A global Proof of Life campaign, including the 81 for 81 challenge, has been launched to demand that the military junta prove she is still alive in good health. Rose Movement has also been organized for her release and release of all political prisoners. Kindly pray her for her life and good health and call for her release. Madam President, military junta's recent sham elections and its manufactured results must be categorically rejected. This fraudulent exercise is a desperate change of uniform. They are basically opening their old playbook. Nothing changed on the ground. They continue committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Therefore, any unwarranted engagement would encourage the military junta to conduct more atrocities, a pattern they have applied for far too long. At the same time, we must also not forget that due to the complete dismantle of the rule of law, transnational organized crime, including online scams, are rising unchecked. On the other hand, the people of Myanmar are forging a unified path forward The recently established Steering Council for the Emergence of a Federal Democratic Union consolidates our political and operational frameworks. I wish to stress that the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the international community, including ASEAN, must discharge their mandates in a decisive, coordinated manner and implement the respective decision effectively and comprehensively, putting an end to the military impunity, restoring the rule of law, and establishing an inclusive democracy that guarantees the rights of all people in Myanmar will serve as a lasting solution. The people of Myanmar are making the ultimate efforts for a peaceful, just, democratic nation. We ask the Assembly and the Security Council to match their courage with immediate and enforceable action. I thank you. The full portion will be available at the e-delegate. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Myanmar. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I thank the Special Envoy for the comprehensive briefing on her recent visit to Myanmar, which provided valuable insights into the current situation in that country. As a country directly affected because of the systematic genocidal violence against the Rohingya community and their forcible expulsion under persecution, Bangladesh would like to make the following points. Rohingya crisis originated in the Rakhine state of Myanmar, and its solution lies in Myanmar. For about a decade, Bangladesh has been bearing the onerous responsibility of hosting about 1.2 million Rohingyas and is sharing its limited resources for its sustenance. The protracted nature of the crisis has caused huge social, economic, security, and environmental impacts on Bangladesh. Now, with funding cuts, the crisis is posing serious challenges for continuation of humanitarian programs. Madam President, finding a durable solution to this long-standing crisis remains one of Bangladesh's top priorities. We would like to request a special envoy to continue to keeping the member states regularly informed of our ongoing engagements and the future plans on Myanmar as mandated by the General Assembly. Last year, during the Rohingya conference in the High-Level Week, we heard directly from the Rohingyas who made it clear that they wanted to return to their own country. Their long-term stay is not viable for Bangladesh and not desirable by them either. We therefore urge the international community and key regional actors, including the ASEAN, to sustain its support and pressure on Myanmar for an early repatriation of the Rohingyas to Myanmar, where they belong. Thank you.
Je remercie le distingué représentant du Bangladesh.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bangladesh and I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Thank you, Mr. President. Singapore thanks Special Envoy Julie Bishop for her briefing and reaffirms our full support for her mandate and efforts to engage all stakeholders towards a resolution to the situation in Myanmar. More than 5 years since the conflict, the situation in Myanmar remains unstable and complex. Hostilities are unabated, civilians continue to bear the heaviest cost, and the humanitarian crisis, compounded by last year's devastating earthquake, has only deepened. This is not a crisis that the international community can allow to recede from view. Singapore's position remains guided by the 5-point consensus, or 5PC. We urge all parties to swiftly and fully implement the 5PC, which is ASEAN's agreed framework for addressing the situation in Myanmar. The principles remain unchanged: a genuine cessation of hostilities, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access regardless of territorial control, and the creation of conditions conducive to inclusive dialogue. We are realistic about the challenges. Progress on implementing the 5PC remain limited, and the conditions necessary to achieve an inclusive political resolution have yet to emerge. Some steps have been taken, but there is much more to be done. But limited progress is not a reason to disengage. The UN has an indispensable role to play, together with ASEAN. The UN must press for the cessation of hostilities, sustain attention on the protection and humanitarian needs of civilians, and keep every channel open for dialogue. We are concerned that amid competing global crises, Myanmar risks slipping off the international agenda. It must not. Sustained UN engagement, including through the General Assembly, is not merely a matter of principle, but as the Special Envoy has alluded to, a test of this organization's relevance. Singapore will continue to do our part within ASEAN and here at the UN. We reiterate our support for the efforts of Special Envoy Julie Bishop, as well as ASEAN Chair the Philippines, including Special Envoy Her Excellency Teresa Lazaro, in engaging all stakeholders and leading ASEAN's response towards a lasting and peaceful resolution in Myanmar. Thank you.
Je remercie la distinguée représentante de Singapour.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this important meeting. Japan would like to express its appreciation to Special Envoy Julie Bishop for her comprehensive briefing. We highly value her sustained engagement with all relevant actors and her unwavering commitment to working closely with member states, particularly in the region. Japan remains deeply concerned that more than 5 years after the coup, the situation in Myanmar continues to deteriorate. We are particularly troubled by the continued loss of innocent lives, including those of women and children, as a result of violence, including airstrikes against civilian facilities such as hospitals and schools. The government of Japan believes that in order to improve the situation in Myanmar, it is essential to achieve meaningful political progress, including the cessation of violence, such as airstrikes, the release of detainees, including Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, and sincere dialogue among all parties concerned, as well as aimed at improving the lives of the people. In this context, guided by its consistent policy of standing by the people of Myanmar in times of hardship, Japan has provided approximately $230 million in humanitarian assistance through international organizations and NGOs since the coup. Japan will continue to provide humanitarian assistance and support aimed at improving people's livelihood in a manner that directly benefit the people of Myanmar. Regarding Rohingya Muslims, Japan highly commends Bangladesh for generously hosting and continuously supporting approximately 1.2 million displaced persons from Myanmar. In March this year, Japan announced assistance totaling approximately $17.5 million through international organizations and NGOs, including support for host communities. In order to improve the situation in Myanmar, it is crucial for the international community to work in a coordinated and united manner. Japan will continue to support ASEAN's efforts, including the implementation of the 5-point consensus, and will work closely with the international community, including the United Nations, toward the improvement of the situation in Myanmar. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for convening this dialogue this afternoon. We also wish to thank Ms. Julie Bishop, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General in Myanmar, for her briefing this afternoon, and of course for her efforts in support of a peaceful resolution to the Myanmar crisis. As chair of ASEAN, the Philippines convened the 48th ASEAN Summit last month, where the ASEAN leaders reaffirmed the importance of the 5-point consensus and underscored the need for cessation of violence, inclusive national dialogue, and timely and unhindered humanitarian assistance. The Philippines remains deeply concerned over the continuing violence and humanitarian challenges faced by the people of Myanmar, including the displaced communities, especially those affected by the situation in the Rakhine State. We believe meaningful progress can only be achieved through an inclusive, Myanmar-owned and led process supported by dialogue and confidence building. Under the Philippine chairmanship, ASEAN has been pursuing practical efforts to advance implementation of the 5-point consensus. Our Secretary of Foreign Affairs, in her capacity as Special Envoy of ASEAN on Myanmar, has engaged a broad range of stakeholders. Sustained engagement with all relevant stakeholders, coupled with practical cooperation on humanitarian and confidence-building measures, remain essential to creating conditions conducive for a political solution. ASEAN continues to strengthen efforts through our AHA Center and partners to expand humanitarian assistance for affected communities, which must be delivered in a safe, timely, effective, and non-discriminatory manner. We welcome recent humanitarian and confidence-building measures, including the release of prisoners and other seemingly positive developments. We hope they do contribute to building trust, reducing tensions, and promoting dialogue among all relevant stakeholders. In this regard, the Philippines underscores the importance of UN support for ASEAN-led humanitarian efforts in Myanmar. The Philippines is also concerned by transnational organized crime, including trafficking in persons, cyber-related crimes, and online scam operations, which have implications on the situation in Myanmar, the region, and beyond. Addressing these issues requires practical cooperation among governments at regional and international levels. Hence, we believe the UN should be actively seized this matter with a view to supporting, among others, regional efforts, such as those being undertaken by ASEAN member states. Finally, we would welcome the Special Envoy's views on how ASEAN and the UN can work together in support of the 5-point consensus, and also on how collaboration can be enhanced between the ASEAN Special Envoy and, of course,
I thank the distinguished representative of the Philippines. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Okay part 1ကပြီးတော့တာမှတ်ထားနော်ဘယ်မှာပြီးတော့ရလဲဆိုမှတ်ထားနော်အဲ့တော့ part 2ကပါကစ္စတန်ကနေစမယ်နော်ပါကစ္စတန်နိုင်ငံကနေစပါပြီနော် okay အားလုံးအဆုံးထိကြည့်ရှုပေးတဲ့သူအားလုံးကနိုင်ငံရေးကိုတက်ကယ်ကိုကိုနိုင်ငံအတွက်ကိုစေတနာတည်တော်လှန်ရေးမှာပေါ့နော်စေတနာအပြည့်အဝပါတဲ့လူတကယ်ကိုဘယ်လိုပြောမှာလဲကျိုးရှိတဲ့လူပေါ့နော်အဲ့လိုပြောရမှာတန်ဖိုးရှိတဲ့လူတာလို့ပြောမယ်ကျေးဇူးအများကြီးတင်ပါတယ်စီကဲ part 2ကိုမျိုးပါချင်းချက်ချင်းတင်ပေးမယ်နော် translate အားလုံးလုပ်ပြီးချက်ပြီးစောင့်ဆောင်လုပ်ပါဦးနော်